It's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Paulla Ebron, Associate Professor of Anthropology at Stanford University. Dr. Ebron is the inaugural Wenner-Gren Fellow in Anthropology and Black Experiences, our very first Wenner-Gren Fellow ever. Special thanks also to the Wenner-Gren Foundation for providing assistance with this fellowship. Today, Dr. Ebron will be speaking about the project she's writing about this year, titled Making Tropical Africa in the Georgia Sea Islands. And rather than me talking more about her work, let's go straight to Dr. Ebron's presentation.
Thank you for attending my presentation. I very much look forward to your comments and questions. In the book I'm writing, Making Tropical Africa, I ask how a region comes into being and what projects help sustain a sense of regional distinctiveness. I pose this question concerning an area off the southeastern coast of the United States, referred to as the Low Country and also as the Georgia Sea Islands. Some of you may have heard of prominent islands such as Hilton Head and Kiowa. Both host exclusive golf and tennis events. These islands are just two of over 100 islands in the region that come and glow with the flow of tides, a concern today as sea levels rise. There is a long history to this area, and as I pursued this research, I often think of a quote of William Faulkner: "The past is never dead, it's not even past." This is the through line that links the historical sweep I take, traversing through several centuries, as an anthropologist might do, to arrive at a point that speaks to current issues, which are the environmental concerns that people in the region increasingly face. The question I address in my talk today is, how does human landscape making shape history and society? This presentation is just a small part of a larger project in which more contemporary themes, such as public memory and political uplift projects, join the effort to address how this region became distinctive. Let me offer a little more of the history of the place before moving to a few specific examples of landscape making. During the early part of the 20th century, linguists, folklorists, anthropologists were intrigued by cultural practices that appeared distinctive. This is an area where the largest number of enslaved Africans arrived in the late 17th century and continued to be brought to the area decades after the official end of the transatlantic slave trade in 1808. Captives reached the area as late as 1850s. These arrivees inspired questions about African continuities and retentions. This formed the tenor of the research conducted in much of the 20th century. An old debate about cultural retention and assimilation certainly drew the attention of anthropologists and other scholars. We know well the impulse to collect what was imagined as disappearing worlds, modernity's others, people who appeared stuck in circular time. The Georgia Sea Islands seemed to fit the desires of scholars and public intellectuals who looked for cultural retentions. Ideas about isolation and distinctive cultural ways are not simply artifacts of a bygone time. They take off even in contemporary projects, such as in promotions of tourism and even in searches for long-lost fictive kin. But what might be missing when we limit our focus on retentions? As I turned to investigate landscape making, this required that I rethink anthropology, as many of us have, as a discipline that permits and even encourages a reflexive relationship to our work. This reflexive engagement led me to return to existing literature with new questions. The return allowed me to go beyond simply asking people to perform for the researchers' questions. Given their long history with researchers, admittedly, there's a degree of fatigue among some of the residents in this area. Instead, I looked for openings that interrupt pervasive taken-for-granted narratives. Here is where I am indebted to Eric Wolf's project in Europe and the People Without History, which inspired him to return to anthropological works that showed the range of global encounters typically overlooked by historians. Wolf found that the existing materials could grant the people absent in historical accounts presence. When affluent British planters arrived in North America to start productive enterprises, and here I refer specifically to 8 prominent Lord proprietors who were given thousands of acres of land by England's King Charles II, they brought with them ideas of landscape making, inspired primarily by what could be and not what was already there. In their dream space, this region could become the northernmost outpost of a tropical empire, a region that encompassed the West Indies and Latin America. Entranced by products such as spices and various plants, provisions and dyes associated with tropical areas, and their unwillingness to concede to terms of Muslim traders, European and British colonizers longed for their own tropical plantations. In the New World, within the Euro-British imagination, albeit different colonial powers, this meant ridding the areas of indigenous people. In this region, this would have included several nations: the Creek, Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminole. Indigenous landscape management schemes were forced to give way to the newly arrived aspirants' plans. Massive efforts went into cutting down trees for fields, exposing streams and creeks, once hidden from direct sunlight, and reimagining the space as an empty space of their dreams, the land of tropical possession. The newly arrived created both emptiness and then the so-called tropical landscapes that facilitated imperial productivity. In many representations of the Sea Islands, the work of landscape change has too often disappeared, even in cultural accounts of dispossession and enslavement. My attention, however, is drawn to the materiality of place. In this, I depart from accounts that aim to give presence only to people. What would it mean, I ask, to bring the material features of landscape change together with the study of the making of social inequalities? At the crux of these two emphases, I find that segregating landforms and segregating human social categories went hand in hand. When I look at this image of a drainage canal, both material and social justice histories come into view. A history of separating land and water to make a particular kind of imperial productivity, a history of dispossession and enslaved labor in which racial enclaves were created. Here, spatial segregation and racial segregation emerge together, and they emerge en route from the old world to the new world. My efforts are to re-narrate a history that refuses to relegate non-humans to passive figures and instead make their activities a crucial part of the story. Inspired by Native American scholars, and I'll only mention Dr. Kim Tallbear, who insists we think beyond our disciplinary comfort zone, beyond our epistemologies, to remember kinship with non-humans. I have embarked upon linking the natural sciences with cultural insights. What emerges is an attentiveness to the vitality of more than humans and their co-presence with humans in landscape making projects. As such, you will see that this is an approach to environmental history that can offer grounded histories inclusive of multi-species. To tell the story of landscape making and disease, I begin with the pest house, a figure in and out of water. There's something about the idea of pest house that draws attention even in its strangeness. Pest houses haunt the boundary of arrivals. They're often placed just between land and sea. They offer ambiguous telling of care, but also death. Are pest houses places that support ailing patients or places that intensify illness? The pest house conjures up humans, but even more. As a site that generates ideas about segregation, pest houses are quarantine sites, particularly for people arriving by ship. But it is a mistake to naturalize our current thinking and imagine quarantine as a site for safety and protection. As I read the record, the goal of North American pest houses was to protect settlers from contagion. In this, spatial segregation and racial segregation emerged together. The pest house is always a retreating figure of arrival into a segregated space. Early Italian references describe pest houses as stationary hospitals on board dock ships or land-based structures on remote islands away from communities. In 15th century Venice, pest houses, or lazarettos, were quarantine sites where maritime travelers, imported goods, remained separated from the mainland. Without this separation, people feared diseases like the plague might enter and infect the general population. This space between sea and land allowed arrivees to recover unless, in the end, they died. 17th century colonial America also found similar concerns about contagion. The arrival of people from distant places introduced new diseases. Planters in what would become the U.S. South, as the importation of enslaved subjects increased, so did stories about African bodies carrying tropical diseases. This allowed for the justification of confining blacks to the region where, by the mid-18th century, black people outnumbered whites by 10-1. Pest houses were one reaction. Perhaps they could keep those diseases away from land-based settlers. I was intrigued by how pest houses worked their way into African American arrivals and the stories people told about these separation sites. I aimed to trace how these stories unfolded. Imagine a copy of a faded and stained mimeograph identifying 4 sites of pest houses off the coast of Charleston, South Carolina. The author writes of her beginning archaeological investigation in which she located 4 18th century sites. After some deliberation, she argues that pest houses were built from east to west after each was sequentially destroyed by storms. A fuzzy old map, as you can see, expanded to show the end of a sea-facing point. It's marked as pest house. There's nothing of the structure left there now. This wonderfully inviting text, which the author admits is preliminary, was my introduction to pest houses. I imagined it would just be the first entry to several explorations of this intriguing stopping point within networks of mobility and disease. Surprisingly, I found that this report remains one of the best documents available on the problem of pest houses in the Sea Islands and the southeastern U.S. Lowcountry. I've stumbled on a few other similarly sketchy reports. For example, in 1900, the Tifton Gazette reported that smallpox had broken out in Berrien, Georgia. The news article offers, quote, "The disease is confined entirely to Negroes and is supposed to have been brought to Irvine and Coffee by migratory hands." The authorities established a pest house and thus acquitted themselves of further responsibility for treatment and care. More recently, the public mood has turned to commemoration. And here you see a sign that in 1958, a pest house marker was placed on Georgia's Tybee Island. Nothing but the marker can be seen. There's nothing there except the empty field. The closer we get, the more the pest house recedes. I think of the pest house with a parallel example, Like the figures of Black people and Black British artist Ingrid Pollard's English Lakeside Country. Pest houses are there and not there. They incite controversy over their reality. Again, they haunt us. It seems, however, we can never actually find them, just their vague, suggestive traces. Enslaved Africans taken from West and Central Africa were brought to ports near Charleston and South Carolina and Savannah, Georgia. These were two of the most concentrated staging areas for enslaved Africans. The transatlantic trafficking in humans vastly expanded to fill the insatiable desires of 18th century plantation settler agriculturalists. People were disembarked on these adjacent islands to urban centers. If quarantined, reportedly, this confinement might be for a period of 10 to 40 days. Now, given the conditions of the voyage, it's likely that for the enslaved, land-based quarantine facilities, however crowded and disease-ridden, might have seemed like a reprieve from what passengers had already endured in dark, cramped holds of the ship. I move here to talk about slave ships as incubators of disease. The lack of material traces of pest houses on Sullivan and Tybee Islands raises questions about slave ships. These two served as pest houses because enslaved people often remained quarantined there before they were allowed to disembark. The ship itself became the quintessential pest house, a place for both the containment and nurture of disease. In contrast to the ghostly traces of the pest house, cargoes of enslaved Africans exist in many of our minds in the iconic drawings and paintings of abolitionists that circulated as broadsides. Today, one of the familiar images is the representation of the ship called Brooks. Here you see bodies lined up as if they were, even with faces, an inanimate stockpile of goods. The image offers a vivid sense of the cramped spaces where captured subjects lay chained together except for a very brief time during the day. Like other slave ships, the Brooks carried hundreds of people during each journey to North America, arranged in the smallest possible space. The race for profit left calculated risks to the sidelines. Within the ship, the specter of the pest house is evident at its most menacing. We find bodies at their most stripped down state, but non-bodies are here too. Packed tight with human cargo, ship hulls were never designed as hospitable places, but these became sites of human death and other than human life, including rats, fleas, parasites, and pathogens. Some captives died from illness, others committed suicide. Yet for other life forms, notably pathogens and pests, these journeys enabled life as the ships became productive breeding places, spreading disease and encouraging new, more virulent forms. According to historians, over 27,000 voyages of ships carried African enslaved people during the transatlantic trade between 1500 and 1866. It seems important to note, too, that there are thousands more uncounted voyages, not only because of unregistered trips during the trade, but also the ships that continued to operate after the trade was officially abolished. Of the 12.5 million enslaved Africans, about 1.8 million died during their journey across the Atlantic, their bodies cast at sea. Sharks circled slave ships, waiting for bodies thrown overboard. A port physician assigned to inspect arriving slave ships described the state of the vessels in the following way. Most of them have had many of their cargoes thrown overboard, some 1/4, some 1/3, some lost half, and I have seen some that have lost 3/4 of their slaves. All the ships he had visited, he said, had smelled most offensive and noisome. He found them filthy and foul from what he called putrid dysentery, and he continued, "It is a wonder any escaped with life." Perhaps the challenge is not so different from what is involved in chasing pest houses on the shore. One must look in the empty spaces and imagine what is there. Between the human bodies portrayed in this illustration, we might look for other bodies and other non-human world-making projects. In this in-between space, life flourished, but again, not just human life. In fact, most of the life that flourished was detrimental to human life. Recent medical research, however, has shown something extraordinary. Slave ships did not just carry around disease organisms and the animals that brought them from host to host. They became breeding grounds for new kinds of disease-carrying animals. Evolution happened on board ship. One pest transported along with humans was the Aegis Egypti mosquito, which until the transatlantic slave trade was only found in the Old World. Aegis Egypti is the carrier of yellow fever, and with its appearance, the New World became a much unhealthier place. However, the presence of yellow fever in the New World was not simply a matter of the transportation of the mosquito. The mosquito transformed in the slave ships, becoming a newly virulent agent of history. The Aegis Egypti mosquito now flourishes in the New World, and it's different from any of the Old World populations that formed its ancestors. The evolution of a strain of Aegis Egypti that lives near humans required a remaking of mosquitoes' lifestyle preferences. Notably, before their trip to the Americas, some Mediterranean variants of Aegis Egypti had become domesticated to human living spaces. In drier areas in northern Africa and the Mediterranean, mosquitoes only lived with humans in the water storage containers of human settlements. Again, in contrast, sub-Saharan African subspecies of Aegis Egypti lay their eggs in tree holes. Because they stay near such water sources and prefer the blood of other animals, they rarely encountered humans. The domesticated characteristics were necessary for mosquitoes living on ships, where the only fresh water came from ship supplies. It is unknown where the ancestors of these domesticated mosquitoes emerged. In one scenario, the ships allowed subspecies to hybridize. In another, a new domestic subspecies evolved independently on the ships. In either case, a new yellow fever-carrying subspecies took form within the trade. The mosquitoes that arrived with enslaved Africans had the characteristics of Mediterranean Aegis Egypti, that is, their attraction to human water sources. Like African Aegis Egypti, they transmitted yellow fever virus. Meanwhile, the yellow fever virus seems to have evolved to better infect humans through this mosquito subspecies. All New World Aegis Egypti come from the lineage that came into being together with the slave trade. The New World strain of Aegis Egypti is specific to this region. It is not found in West Africa today, except as a reintroduction into ports. This New World subspecies spread to Asia in the 19th century, where it became a transmitter of dengue fever. This subspecies is derived from a single genetic lineage, the lineage of the one transformed on the slave ships. The transatlantic slave and captive humans made a human-mosquito virus relationship that proved unusually effective in making people sick. Ships carried large quantities of stored potable water, usually enough to last throughout the voyage or to the next port of call, creating a habitable environment for mosquito breeding. The new ship-borne strain of domesticated Aegis aegypti mosquito also found a continual source of fresh blood among the African captives taken from tropical and subtropical regions en route to coastal New World sites in the Caribbean and North America. Indeed, white settlers and traders came to imagine Africans as disease carriers merely by their racialized bodies. Once a ship neared a port city, efforts were made to rid the vessel of its ill passengers by throwing afflicted bodies overboard, whether dead or alive. The ship was required to sit offshore to await the arrival of a medical inspector who was required to issue a certificate of health. The inspector could take days to arrive. Upon inspection, any hint that the ship had visited places closely associated with disease would be grounds for quarantine. As already said, sometimes the ship's inhabitants, both enslaved and crew members, were required to disembark on adjacent islands away from the city's center. Diseased bodies were sent to the pest house, that is, simply another house of pestilence. Throughout its travels, Aegis aegypti has been able to adapt to a variety of environmental conditions. Its ability to reproduce is in urban water sources suggests the ways that yellow fever, once on shore, may have taken off to become an epidemic in the port cities along the U.S. East Coast. The landside journey of the ship-nurtured yellow fever mosquito can be seen in the trail of pest houses built to contain it. For example, in South Carolina, fear of yellow fever and malaria inspired an act by the state's legislators that ordered the construction of a pest house located on Sullivan's Island, mentioned previously. The pest house lasted there until a dramatic hurricane washed the structures away, and most of the people, the inhabitants as well, except for 8 to 10 people, reportedly, who clung to debris of wood sherds. Similarly, in the mid-18th century, Tybee Island, located near, again, Savannah, Georgia, became the site of a new pest house building, said to be a 2-story house made of tabby brick with low ceilings, few windows, and little ventilation. Conditions were grim. Slavery made this landscape in both its physical materiality and its histories of race and inequality. Mosquitoes, including Aegis aegypti, as lively historical actors, were able to adjust to new living conditions and form new variants. In the containment practices of slave ships, diseases came into their own. Now I move to talk about disease environments for malaria and how they were created through the plantation system. The 3 most deadly diseases introduced by European invasion of the New World were yellow fever, malaria, and smallpox. European settlers were self-conscious that they had introduced smallpox, and even, upon occasion, aimed to spread it further to decimate Native American communities. But African captives brought to work on plantations were blamed for yellow fever and malaria. As we find above, it is unclear whether the ancestor of the mosquito variant that carries yellow fever virus was introduced from the Mediterranean or West Africa. The same is true for malaria parasites. Malaria is caused by blood parasites of the genus Plasmodium, of which there are several species. Records show that Plasmodium vivax was introduced to the New World by by white settlers before they brought captive Africans. The more deadly disease, however, is caused by Plasmodium falciparum. It is still commonly discussed as carried to the New World by Africans. Disease caused by P. falciparum was recorded from Italy as early as the Roman Empire. There is no reason, then, to believe it was not also carried from the Mediterranean, perhaps by sailors. More importantly, disease historians who focus on the origins of a disease may be asking the wrong question. As we have seen with debates about masking and vaccinations for COVID-19, the question of whether Omicron variant came from South Africa or not is less important than the kinds of disease environments we create. And the same is true for malaria. Malaria parasites cannot infect humans directly. They infect the blood only when transmitted by the bite of mosquitoes. The only mosquitoes that can carry malaria parasites are classified in the genus Anopheles. By chance, from the perspective of the malaria parasites, the New World, just like the Old World, has native Anopheles mosquitoes. Anopheles quadrimaculatus live in swamps and forests across the southeastern part of North America. When malaria parasites arrived together with Europeans' invasion, mosquitoes native to America became carriers of the Old World parasites, bringing them into New World ecologies. A. quadrimaculatus does not prefer the blood of humans. In fact, A. quadrimaculatus prefers almost any big mammal other than humans, including horses and cows. Its favorite blood meal is the white-tailed deer that long occupied the same area. White settlers, in their will for profit, worked hard to rid the Low Country of copious white-tailed deer they found at first settlement. Deer skins proved to be a profitable commodity. They were easily obtained, stored, and marketed, and the sale of the skins helped provide extra funds for plantation enterprises. It did not take long to rid the region of its white-tailed deer. Meanwhile, as one historian explains, the absence of large-scale cattle herding in antebellum South Carolina, which would have afforded alternative hosts for the mosquito vector, conceivably contributed to the increased incidence of human malaria. In the absence of other sources, humans became the alternative. In instances of landscape transformation that required the removal of tree stumps, indeed, enslaved men were often expected to assume the responsibility of clearing fields. They spent hours in the mud. The mosquitoes, which do not fly far from the water sources in which they lay their eggs, always stay close to the ground, and they might not have otherwise have had many encounters with humans. What it took to saturate this region with malaria was the condition of servitude. Enslaved men and women were stuck in swamps all day, first clearing large tracts of land of native vegetation and trees, and then working in rice fields and indigo fields. Captive bodies became available blood meals, and the more parasites that circulated, the easier it was for any given individual to get malaria. Rice fields were the first big European investment in an imagined tropical colony in the Low Country. As epidemiologists explain, malaria became a statewide disease, occupying wherever rice fields, ponds, and undrained lands were found. In years of great storms and hurricanes, the problem was exacerbated by the increase in breeding sites. Influential historians, whose work later inspired a recent work by a geographer, point out that in benefiting from the knowledge and skills of enslaved Africans, planters were able to organize production of a crop that they would otherwise have had to obtain from Asia. Imagining North America as their own domain allowed British expansionists to avoid the power of others in the market. By the mid-1700s, tidal rice became the preferred method of planting rice on the coast. Planting season began after the first frost in early March. Rice fields required moisture, often water above the surface, as you can see here. The fields were irrigated as the plants began to take root. Preparing the fields required turning soil and clearing weeds. This is a system that required clearing swamps, building dikes, and what is now recognized as an important way of separating ocean and fresh water. The activity of sowing and tending to rice fields then requires standing in water and mud. Rice fields recognize the landscape through forest clearing, drainage, and irrigation. This reorganization had non-design effects. Colonial rice fields turned out to be ideal environments for A. quadrimaculatus. These mosquitoes preferred the warmer environments that resulted in clearing trees. They prefer water with plants, partially immersed. These are the ideal conditions for laying eggs and growing larvae. A medical geographer explains the vegetation anchors the larva against water movement, feeds it, shelters it from fish, and the result in A. quadrimaculatus proliferating in sunny waters where the foliage can flourish. Rice was not the only plantation crop associated with malaria. In the second half of the 18th century, indigo joined rice as a thriving plantation crop for this would-be tropical colony. Once the rice shoots began to grow, some of the people assigned to work in rice fields might be shifted to indigo plantations. Indigo plantations were typically in relative close proximity to rice fields, not quite as submerged in a swampy area, but close enough by. Indigo also attracted anopheles. Water for processing vats, as well as from rainwater that left puddles from frequent afternoon storms during the summer, was available for mosquito reproduction. While making disease environments appears an unattended effect, planters soon learned that fields and fevers went together. As the rice trade expanded, planters also decided that Africans could tolerate the effects of malaria better than white people. The trade in humans picked up as more people were brought to the low country. Planters knew they were creating unhealthy environments, although they tended to blame, again, African presence for the problem. When a wave of fevers threatened Charleston, for example, the city governors asked planters to move their rice fields further from the edge of the city. Planters' awareness about disease, indeed, had important effects itself. Affluent planters and their families moved away, choosing to govern the region from afar. During the mosquito-thick summer and early autumn months, the plantation families retreated to higher ground. In contrast to other areas of the U.S. South, the Low Country became the region with few whites. The residential population, as I mentioned, was 10 to 1. 10 black people to 1 white person. A unique labor system emerged known as the task system. People were assigned tasks for the day and were required to complete the task. This system possibly emerged to stem fears of insurrection and escapes. An association of the region with tropical disease created the imagined Africanity of the sea islands. However, as I've shown, this tropicality had to be created. Diseased environments were plantation environments in which unhealthy conditions were fostered. A medical historian noted, most Americans think of malaria as a tropical nuisance, if they think of it at all. I argue that the conditions of tropicality were sewn into the US landscape by the plantation economy. We are close here to the figuration I point to for the Anthropocene. Disease environments are created and then left for disposable people while elites scramble away. Now to move towards a summary. Landscape form has been essential to the imperial project. And what I hope I have conveyed is that a fuller description of landscape history brings to the surface stories beyond settler narratives. Instead of imagining landscape through the view from the house or the first-person diaries and journals, we can imagine a much larger picture. Imagine instead the state in which you are forced to spend long hours, 6 days a week, working in swamps, where there is no way to avoid the environment's unrelenting conditions. Now you are deep in the world of mosquitoes, blood parasites, and viruses. Now you are in the world of landscape history as experienced by its less glorified participants. Some have argued against telling stories of humans and non-humans together because it is believed that this further demeans people who so often have been seen as less than human. Attention to more than human worlds take away from the concerns about social justice. But I've been arguing the opposite. Only by attending to the histories of landscape, including swamps, mosquitoes, and disease organisms, can we possibly understand the history of enslavement and dispossession in North America. I am, however, encouraged by the work of African American scholars who have begun to think about the environment and natural history not as concerns that are antithetical to Black sociality. Landscape transformation as a key element of the imperial project, from its multi-species invasion of the New World to its well-elaborated systems of settler colonialism and racial capitalism. As long as scholars ignore the materialities of landscape, we are stuck imagining forms of imperial power that depend entirely on pre-made racial ideologies. Since these ideologies are imagined as ahistorical, there's nothing we can do to change the situation. In contrast, beginning with landscape transformation in the making of human social injustices brings history immediately into our analysis. The form of race known in the United States began on the plantation with the division between captives forced to work on the one hand and owners and supervisors on the other. Of course, race has taken on further life, but it still echoes plantation logics. In the Sea Islands and Low Country, race takes its form in part through the task system, which allowed a certain degree of autonomy, even while encapsulating that autonomy within the violence of slavery, which is blamed for the very tropicalities built into the plantation system. If we want to build abolition into our analysis, we need to start much closer to the ground. At the muddy sea edges of a set of new disease environments were formed by the imperial plantation projects. Pest houses emerged there in those amphibious environments. They signaled the need to protect elites from new forces of contagion that emerged from imperial landscape transformation, including its transcontinental shipping, the moving of people, plants, animals, and disease organisms. Spaces that once had been rich with more than human life quickly became places of more than human death, as well as imperial profit. It is here where we might understand racial ecologies that resonate today. Thank you.
Paulla, that was a truly wonderful talk. Just a terrific start for our colloquium series. Thank you. There's so much there, such a rich talk. I don't know that we'll be able to do it justice in a Q&A, but let me start, if I may start with the first question, since I'm here on the screen. Well, firstly, I loved your quote of Faulkner, and it clicked for me when you mentioned later in the talk, it clicked why you might have started with a Faulkner quote, "The past isn't even past." When you mentioned dengue, I work in a place in Cuba where dengue is a scourge of today, and it's a bad one. And you know, everyone who works there and lives there has to be careful about those mosquitoes to this day. And there's a lot of work being done to mitigate that scourge, but to see that sort of cyclicality of the past isn't even past. I did not know the history of dengue going back through what you've traced out today. So it was grim to hear that a lot of your stuff is not happy, but it's really important to understand, and it gives us a deeper knowledge. I had another question though. That's really just an observation. I thought that tied together beautifully. But early on, you had a wonderful image of a canal that was built, right? Dug probably by human labor. And at first, at that time, you were talking about the Euro-British kind of attempt to create a certain kind of landscape. And I thought you were showing us that to show us how they drained the area so they could plant, right?
Yeah.
But isn't there also a project that emerges to continue to drain the area to get rid of the mosquitoes? Are the canals not also used in that way, or am I wrong? What was the intent of that canal or those canals?
Initially, they were the places that ships or boats would take the crops away to central places within South Carolina. Georgetown is one place. And so partly the way that landscape allowed mosquitoes to thrive is you needed water to grow the very things. Certainly with rice, there's this constant flooding of the land until it sort of takes roots. So there's no way to escape, historically anyway, introducing that kind of environment. And that picture is actually a more recent one, which suggests that people are still keeping water in place, should we say.
So they weren't also used to drain swampland to fight off mosquitoes? I know that in Cuba, that's been one of the goals of more recent canal making, to fight, because now we at least understand the relationship between standing water and mosquitoes. So there's attempts to use canalage to get rid of standing water.
It's an interesting question. You know, in another piece of this, where I'm writing about the contemporary scene, I'm sure that they are heavily sprayed with insecticide. So that's the primary way of trying to keep mosquitoes. Yes, but in that piece, I talk about going very early in the morning, thinking that we could escape mosquitoes, but in fact, they hadn't really retired from their night work. And it was really quite intense, should we say.
Let me turn to people's questions and let's see if we can get started here. The first question we have was from Anand Taneja, and he writes, "Thank you for this wonderful talk. If landscape form is, as you say, essential to the imperial project, how might landscape form also be essential to resistance/decolonization?"
It's a very good point, and I think much of when I think of this project, there sort of have been two different sort of streams of thought, many, but two main. That is where the historians are and where the anthropologists are, and anthropologists being very attentive to the ways that people live their everyday lives and create, for example, one frequently mentioned piece are the gardens that enslaved people had of their own. So working on one hand, long hours on these plantationscapes, but then after hours, cultivating their own crops. And what's interesting about this region, I mentioned the task system, that people often talk about this system where enslaved people were left pretty much on to their own devices, if you will, and manage their time. And they were even allowed to sell products that they had grown on these grounds. And I stay away from, I sort of veer away from that part in this talk, just because it's where everyone's mind turns to. And my intent here, I think, is to how do we put in this idea of grounded stories, put multiple things at work so that enslaved people aren't on one side doing their thing and we celebrate their creativity, and the planter projects on another side, but to think about how we bring these things in closer contact as a way to rewrite a history that puts usually the people not allowed to speak in these historical accounts into closer view.
Yeah, for sure. Well, and you've got a rich tapestry here, because there's also the entanglement of the human and non-human, which clearly has sort of a cyclical iteration, reiteration, and so forth. Okay, so let's move to the next question. This is from Linda Hull, sorry. What standard practices of disease control were especially endangering to the vulnerable crowds in pest houses? Lack of fresh water for washing, lack of understanding of general germ transmission, and so forth. So what practices were especially endangering?
Well, they suffered from lack of ventilation. I mean, it is the information on pest houses is really kind of sketchy, to be quite honest. Not only are there just a few sites, and in fact, I've thought of going beyond the US South to ask what were the conditions further up the coast, because they are along the East Coast. But as I said, it's a question of if the intent was really one of getting people to recover. They weren't like sanitary facilities, sort of drop the people off, as I understand it, and then go forward with every effort to make sure this doesn't spread wider than these relatively contained spaces. But as we know with disease, in our own most recent history, it's very difficult to contain that which seems to take on a life of its own. But also in this question is, well, what did people know at the time, which they didn't know until the end of the 19th century, of what really caused these diseases, malaria, et cetera. So,
Charles Finley from Cuba,
yes,
who's a
exactly.
national hero in that country
Yes.
to this day for his discoveries with mosquitoes and disease, the same diseases you're talking about.
Mhm.
We have a question here from Betty Santandrea. I hope I pronounced that right. Do you think you could get South Carolina historical sites to incorporate your amazing talk into the training of their volunteers? I was a docent at Middleton Place in Charleston, South Carolina. Well, she was a docent. I'm just reading her question.
Yes.
Yes.
You know, I've had a long history of going back and forth to various plantations. So if you're at Middleton, you must know then Boone Hall, for instance. I think I'm pretty sure it's Middleton that really tried to, and you probably know better, really tried to incorporate much more of the story of enslaved people, for instance, and ran into a little bit of tension, shall we say. I know that towards the end of towards like by around 2000, there was every effort to push plantations to incorporate a larger story. But it met with some resistance. And I was told that docents had to follow a script up until perhaps 2000, where maybe there was some more leeway. I think who controls the narrative, if you will, I mean, is always the question. But there's been a lot of interest in sort of pulling the story out in more ways, partially because of the diversity of people going to these plantation sites now. Not all looking for Gone with the Wind kind of stories.
Right. I learned from Rolf Trujillo's work that different contexts require different techniques to get at unsilencing the past, right? Depending on what kind of records are available and what kind of historiography exists in a particular context. But that's what you're addressing as well here. There's a question, anonymous question. Are there any records from medical inspectors in archives for the pest houses, I presume?
It's a very helpful suggestion. You know, I have to say that most of my attention has gone to the secondary sources, because the inspiration for this project was one of looking at primarily the work that scholars had done and trying to, as I think I say in the talk, re-narrate, you know, to use the interpretations that were there. So unlike a historian who might go combing extensively through primary documents, the thing that I thought, again, inspired by Eric Wolf and a group of people at the beginning of the 80s, is how do we use the material that's already there in imaginative ways? What kinds of questions emerge for us now that may not have been, they certainly lie within the some of the material that's collected, but can we reinterpret, reimagine, or expand how we see some of that material? So it's a different project than searching through, again, the primary documents, which for me felt like I was coming up against some of the same repetitive themes in some of the historical literature. However, that's a really great suggestion, since there is a level of frustration of feeling like, well, I can't say a whole lot more about pest houses other than this mimeograph thing and a few sketchy points, which I find unsatisfying. So thank you.
Here's a question from Anne Obraf Hajal. again, I apologize if I'm mispronouncing a surname. Absolutely fascinating talk. The segregation of kidnapped Africans in the rice areas reminds me a bit of redlining today, though it's additionally fascinating that slaveholders created these environments via rice and mosquitoes, along with the fantasy that Black people were better able to tolerate mosquito-borne illnesses. It's fascinating to think of webs of historical connections among kidnapped people, slaveholders, nature, evolution of species aboard crowded ships, etc.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's really a comment, I guess, more than a question. I absolutely, that summarizes a lot of what I thought of how this talk was so beautiful and rich. One of the things that I also might add is that it just, you talk about how the sort of the association of tropical disease, that it's a created thing and not something that can, I mean, you show that beautifully, that these are created, the disease is imported, the landscape is altered, it's all a built environment in a broad sense. But I also was thinking at a certain point, the idea that this is really from Bruno Latour's work, I think, that nature itself is a cultural category. You know, the idea, we think of these as natural environments. There was nothing natural, but probably not even pre-European arrival either. There were probably people for thousands of years who had altered the environments in ways we don't recognize as having been human altered. But certainly, you know, again, that canal image shows this so beautifully, that there is alteration going on.
But just to follow up on the previous comment, you know, there's some really close, I think the issue for me is one of scale. You know, people certainly did transformations of landscapes like forever and ever, but the scale of this is a question that we now grapple with. We have to live with, most recently, the hurricane in Florida, built on unstable, in a place that shouldn't have that kind of real estate enterprise going on, right? So it's an area that could easily flood, was very vulnerable. And I think the question for me is, okay, knowing all of this, what do we need? How do we need to think about building infrastructures and, you know, a more generative way of thinking about the future that we all face, you know? And I think what existed and continues to exist is this idea that the future will take care of itself in some way, and yet we live with the aftermath, the effects, if you will. It's not the aftermath of not being able to project out far enough a number of related processes that need to be considered. So,
can I ask? I know this is far beyond, but we have by the way, folks who are still with us, if you want to add a question, please do. We have a little bit of time for one or two more questions. But Paulla, I'm just curious, this is probably a question you get, and it's maybe unfair, I apologize, but we're all thinking about changes in the climate these days. And obviously you're part of the world you're working with and thinking about, have studied, is close to the sea. I mean, so to what extent are you, in your larger work, are you wrestling with what we might project about the changes coming to the region, as well as the ones you've traced out beautifully? Because as you pointed out, the past isn't even past. I mean, it would seem that those future changes, the more we know about the past you're tracing, the better equipped we might be to think about the future and to prepare for it. I don't know if you wrestle with that in your larger work, or if that's a separate project.
It isn't. I mean, this is one section of three, but part of its inspiration comes from things that people said to me someone in Georgia talked about how water used to, you could tell that the tide would rise with the full moon. And now water shows up any old time and it's concerning to them. It's actually the island that Clarence Thomas was born on, Pinpoint, Georgia. And this person just said, you know, we have to live here at very low-lying area, and what are we going to do? You know, because it's not even, it's as if, and I think now to South Carolina, where it was never stable ground. It was always swampy, and it was sort of this effort of filling in. Well, now the tides rise higher and higher, and yet there's a big real estate boom taking place on these former plantation sites. So it's almost like you're walking into what could be, or paying for what very easily could be, a disaster zone. So the good thing about South Carolina, at least the Charleston area, is trying to rethink this escalation of sea rise and what its impact might be. But, you know, storms are getting more and more intense. So how can you not think, is this the right place to build? Or how are these seawalls going to hold if things are intensifying, you know?
Oh, man. Yeah, let's see if we have another question that's not so grim. Gosh. We do have another question here. Let's see. Oh, again from Anne. I'm an artist with a PhD in Russian history. I do highly researched art about history and its basis in landscape, geography, landform. Is your approach being replicated by other anthropologists anywhere? I will certainly look for both of your books now. That's much more uplifting. Thank you, Anne.
You know, I'm very inspired by someone you may have heard of, who's probably as famous as Bruno Latour. That's Donna Haraway and Anna Singh. Anna Singh is trained as an anthropologist, and Donna more history of science, you will. And together, they have been very talkative about something they call, I guess most recently, like the plantation scene. So it's exciting to see this conversation between anthropology and someone who does science. I think that ultimately is the excitement I feel, having spent, I didn't talk about the field work for this. The field work in an unconventional way was really sort of some part of it going to workshops with historians and spending a long time trying to appreciate how historians approach a question, methods. And then I discovered, well, there's somebody missing from these conversations, and that's natural scientists. And what do I learn by stepping out of my comfort zone to understand some of the debates that are going on within among botanists and scientists of various kind of medical scientists as well. And what the reason why it seems so important is it allowed me as an anthropologist to appreciate that, you know, there are fields that are going on, debates that are going on that somehow seem to not touch the cultural repetitive themes that some people like to talk about. One of the things that happened in this area, 2007, is a 4-state area was designated as the Gullah-Geechee National Heritage Corridor. I talk about in the beginning. And this process of generating what people think should represent their island contribution. And a lot of it seemed to retreat into some of the cultural retentions and some of the debates that anthropologists have been so central in. And yet, it felt like, yes, but there's much, much more. And in fact, you're asking questions of how do we grow heirloom crops? How do we form this dialogue with some of the scientists that on one of the islands, the scientists and the local people don't even, according to one resident, don't even speak to each other. And yet the resident felt like, well, why aren't we a part of this? We've lived here. We know this place better than these people who come for the summer. So it's this kind of multiple tracks of what's interesting to people that don't always get come to the surface in even something like the Heritage Corridor, because you're asked to generate some sense of authentic culture. And yet here are these other concerns of people that for me is exciting because it pulls the conversation much broader and ties with some of the concerns of people in this region.
Oh, that's a great answer. There's one more question. The longer we talk, the more questions will come in. I think we need to call it after this, though. It is 3:15. Let's see. This is from Linda Hull again. Thank you for drawing elements together that make a whole rather than just addressing them as if they stand alone without connection. Very engaging. And I 100% wholeheartedly concur. And thank you, Linda, for a great summary comment. Folks, another thank you from Patricia Largo. Thank you again, Dr. Ebron, for your wonderful talk, starting us off on a real high note, even though some of the material was grim.
Yes.
But it's good. It's really well done and beautifully done. And thank you. These talks end sort of abruptly. That's the nature of a webinar. I'm sorry. It always feels like we should have a little chance to socialize informally and welcome that. But that's just the trade-off we make with a webinar. So thank you for attending. Oh, another thank you from Francis O'Shaughnessy. So there we go. I think, okay.
And I'll say thank you as well.
Well, thank
Your
you.
comments and questions.
And thanks again to the Wenner-Gren Foundation for underwriting the talk as well. All right, everyone, till next time.